an extraordinary UN career, which I've personally witnessed in various countries around the world. 3 decades of work in a range of capacities in peacekeeping, in humanitarian action, and also in development cooperation, working in Asia, Latin America, Africa, as well as at UN headquarters in New York. So truly a remarkable career, which is, I think, speaks to the individual as a man of great integrity and I think great intellectual ability. He will, as among the things he's done since he's been back in New York as Special Advisor to the Secretary General, he supported the SG on issues relating to frontier technologies to ensure the follow-up to the high-level panel on digital cooperation and leadership that the Secretary General convened, brought together some of the leading figures in the world of digital cooperation from the business sector, from global institutions, from international organizations. And again, that was a landmark report that was published, I think, to wide acclaim. And Fabrizio Hochschild was very much one of the led that work on behalf of the Secretary General, and indeed, I think was very instrumental in making sure the report that came out had wide circulation and discussion. So without much more to say, I'll now ask Under Secretary General Hochschild to lead off with his keynote remarks. So welcome, Fabrizio. Look forward to hearing from you. May I ask others, by the way, in the meantime, to mute your mics so that we don't interrupt inadvertently.
Thank you so much, and it's a great pleasure to be with you all, and especially to see you again, Alan, who's been such a model and a mentor to many of us in our UN careers. Let me say at the outset, I hope everybody's in good health and dealing with these extraordinary times. As Mr. Doss indicated, the 2020 was the 75th anniversary of the UN, but is very unlikely to be remembered for that. There was, even before the onset of COVID, a decision by the Secretary General that, given the rather strange place where we were heading, there was a need to mark the 75th anniversary very differently from any previous anniversary. There was a strong sense, even before the onset of the pandemic, that we were living a unique and potentially very dangerous contradiction between an ever-growing number of challenges that could only be tackled, only mastered through international cooperation, and at the same time, a withdrawal from the very mechanisms that have been set up in the aftermath of the Second World War to deal with international challenges. And of course, first and foremost on that list is climate change, but also ever more protracted conflict, growing inequalities, demographic trends where we have unprecedented youth bulges in some parts of the world and equally unprecedented proportions of ever older becoming elderly populations in other parts of the world. And it was against that background that the Secretary General felt that we should use the 75th anniversary not to do the usual anniversary thing of highlighting all our achievements, although of course there was an element of that, but more to go out on what he called a global listening tour, to reach out to peoples across the world and take a global reality check, to ask people, what are your hopes for the future? What would you most like to see in the world 25 years from now? What are your biggest fears? What do you see as the biggest threat to that future? And what are your expectations of the United Nations, of multilateralism, to address any discrepancy between the world you hope for and the world we might end up with if current megatrends are not better addressed? And then we also, in April, added questions related to people's priorities for post-COVID recovery. And we drew an unprecedented amount of data. We heard from literally millions of people in all 193 states, in addition to our own direct outreach through a mini survey tool, through so-called UN 75 dialogues. We also commissioned independent studies and AI analysis to have a reality check through a scientific and independent methodology of our findings. And we analyzed and put together all these findings and presented them to member states, who took them into account in a declaration they issued on the 21st of September, the so-called UN 75 declaration. There are a number of things that were striking in results, and I'll talk about them briefly, and then I'll talk about 3 or 4 things that I think are lessons learned that we can draw for peace building. First, in terms of people's post-COVID recoveries, the chief priority everywhere was for better access to basic public services, access to health, access to education, access to water sanitation. And that was everywhere. That was in the richest countries as in the poorest countries. And that's perhaps not so surprising against the background of a public health emergency. But the second main priority of people in the immediate aftermath of COVID was perhaps a little more surprising. And that was for ever greater solidarity, for more support to the hardest hit countries, the hardest hit communities. And related to that, a call to adjust our economic model to make it more inclusive and to better tackle inequalities and extreme poverty. With regard to climate change, with regard to long-term priorities, pandemic notwithstanding, the major priority was the damage we're doing to our environment and climate change. And that was pretty universal, and it was throughout all regions. Related priorities were better upholding of human rights, prevention of conflict, and better dealing with corruption. And the importance of corruption was one of the striking and unexpected findings. Now, we published our findings in great detail, and there are many, many nuances, many interesting points. One can search our findings by country, by age group, by gender. I won't go into that, but I do, with the time I still have remaining, want to highlight 4 points that I think are particularly relevant to the theme of the meeting today. First, as I mentioned, especially with regard to longer term priorities, a lot of concerns around conflict. But it is not only conflict in the most traditional sense in which we understand it. Strikingly, people in the richer countries that have high degrees of peacefulness are more worried about conflict between states and the threat of nuclear. People living in conflict affected countries are most worried about internal conflict. But next to conflict, there's a very strong concern around political violence. And the rise of political violence as a dominant concern was quite striking, as was the rise of concerns in many parts of the world, notably in Central America, around organized crime and the link between organized crime and violence. And then gender violence, gender-based violence was also a very large concern. So it's clear that we have to understand conflict and violence in a much broader context than the traditional intrastate or interstate understanding of conflict, which has tended to be our focus in the UN. The second point I want to highlight is conflict concerns were embedded very much in concerns around a deficit in respect for human rights and human dignity, very much embedded in concerns around environmental destruction, and, as I mentioned, in concerns around inequality, poverty, and corruption. And again, I think this points towards the need to deal less in our traditional silos and in a much more joined up way with conflict resolution and conflict prevention. Alan himself, during his time in the UN, was a pioneer of those more joined up approaches. And much as we've made progress, there is still some way to go. The third point, and for me this was very important, at a time of what many argue is a very strong polarization and disunity, and we certainly feel that in New York. We certainly see that in the paralysis that the disagreements often lead to in the Security Council, but also less visibly in the General Assembly. We see that in the aggressive headlines that dominate the interstate, especially among the superpowers, but not only the superpowers discourse. So one gets the sense, if one reads social media or UN reports or follows the GA, of a very divided humanity. But what came out of our surveying is something quite the opposite. When you ask people about what their hopes are for the future, when you ask people about what their fears are for the future, when you ask people what their expectations are of international cooperation, there is remarkable unity across regions, across income groups, across the political spectrum. And I think that points to something. I think some people have made the point that much of the polarization is fabricated also through social media, which has algorithmically privileges difference and boosts it and multiplies it in many ways. But of course the difference is there, but it doesn't tell the whole story. And there is, especially in terms of people's aspirations for the sort of world they would wish their children and grandchildren to live in, a remarkable amount of unity that often gets overshadowed by the louder voices of polarization. And I think that's terribly important because it is obviously a key ingredient that provides a basis for reconciliation and peace in a superficially very fragmented, very fractured, very polarized world. And the final point I want to point out, and we did some of this in supporting the Colombia peace process, but we did find, induced by COVID, that we had no choice but to go virtual and do everything online. But that allowed us to reach literally millions of people and hear their voices and synthesize their voices and present them in ways that if we'd only followed analog means would have been much more difficult. And I think the digital means of bringing voices of we the peoples into processes and making them count and helping use them to steer policy deliberations or peace talks for that matter is something where is a huge instrument where there's still untapped potential to give peace-building process greater legitimacy. So in the interest of time, I'll stop there. But I just want to conclude by saying, our findings are being used to drive forward a process of innovation of multilateralism, which I think is needed. From our survey, it became very clear that there's universal support for multilateralism, but at the same time, people don't want more of the same. They want international engagement that's more inclusive, more effective, more transparent. And we hope our findings will help contribute to that. Thank you. I think you're on mute, Ellen.
Right, thank you for that reminder. But thank you above all for that excellent, masterful survey of the outcome of the findings, all of which I'm sure resonate certainly with me, and I'm certainly almost certain that that's also the case for our colleagues on the panel and indeed the wider audience. I don't know how long we can retain you, Fabrizio. You're a very busy man, and I don't know whether you will be able to stay for a little while, and then we can pick up on some of the points you made, because they are, especially the very last one, about how this brave new world actually can be used to fortify enlightened multilateralism, more progressive multilateralism. So I hope you can stay for a little while, and we'll be able to come back to perhaps, as I say, pick up on some of those really important points you made, as well as the broader findings through the survey, which is absolutely fascinating. Great. Well, many, many thanks for that. And I'm going to then perhaps now move to our panel. We have 6 panelists, but 5 presentations, because we have a combined one from which you will be interested in, of course, Fabrizio, being the ex-UN representative in Colombia, which you did with such great flair and progress when you were there. So let's move then to our panel, and I'd like to start with, and you'll all excuse me if I mispronounce your names, and I apologize ahead of time if I do, but we're going to start with Ursula Bader, who is from the Digital Networks and Society Department of the Telecommunications Development Bureau at the International Telecommunications Union based in Geneva. And Ms. Bader has been working for international and non-governmental organizations for a number of years, of which the last 3 have been at the UN, the ITU, if I'm not mistaken. And she's, besides working, she's also enrolled in the UNITAR Oxford Brookes University Master's Program in Humanitarian Action and Peacebuilding, which I'm sure underpins a lot of your work with ITU. And of course, we'll be continuing to develop your experience and exposure in these fields of humanitarian and the educational sector. You talk a little bit, if you will, then about your story, Ursula, which is using communication technologies to save lives and keep economies going, which is a good segue to what Mr. Hochschild was just talking about how they have found that the use of technology, these new platforms, have been able to contribute much more. We can connect more and therefore get more diversity, what we say and what we think and how we act. So perhaps you'll give us your story in those 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all, and a happy new year. It's my great pleasure to join you today. As COVID-19 emerged, it has transformed our lives significantly. Despite the restriction we live under and the health precautions we're constantly taking to keep others and ourselves healthy, we suddenly entered the stay-home phase. We turned to our digital devices to receive updated public health information, keep in touch with our families, friends, and loved ones, carry out our professional and academic work. The pandemic highlighted further the essential role of information and communication technologies play for societies to function. It also brought to the fore the alarming digital inequalities between and within countries. Being able to connect to this meeting today, we should be aware, and more importantly, grateful that we are the fortunate ones. The reality is that almost half of the world population, 3.6 billion people, have never ever been connected, and it remains a challenge. As a United Nations specialized agency for information and communication technologies, we're tirelessly working towards the goal of extending digital networks and services to everyone and to bridge this digital divide. ICTs play an important role not only in our daily lives, but are also an instrument in crisis management, humanitarian aid, social economic development, and peace building. The ITU staff have been working around the clock to help countries to fully utilize digital technologies to respond to and recover from COVID-19, and to build preparedness for similar future global emergencies. To name a few new innovative tools and areas of our work on a multi-sectoral collaboration includes the Global Network Resilience Platform, which was launched to help policymakers, regulators, and industry players to ensure that networks are kept resilient and telecom services are available to all to the maximum extent possible. Our Connect to Recover initiative reinforces affordable and reliable connectivity in beneficiary countries as they adjust to the new norm. Collaboration amongst UN agencies and other sectors proved to be vital in order to achieve an impact. From a health point of view, the WHO ITU Be Healthy, Be Mobile initiative, and with support from UNICEF, we have been working with telecommunication companies to text people that might not have access to internet directly in their mobile phones with vital messages to help protect them from COVID-19. So far, the initiative has reached millions of people across Niger, Senegal, Sudan, and Tunisia. We also joined the COVID-19 Global Education Coalition led by UNESCO to ensure that learning continues for more than 1.5 billion students across the globe affected by school closures. Around 830 million learners globally do not have access to computer. The Agenda for Action launched by 8 UN agencies places children protection from violence in context of COVID-19 as top priority for governments and provides concrete recommendations to safeguard children's well-being. ITU is also a part. As for capacity building, we have the ITU Academy, which is our main online gateway to our capacity development activities. Under one umbrella, it brings together a wide range of training activities and knowledge resources on the field of ICTs and digital development. Some of its main pillars are training courses, workshops, and seminars. But because my colleagues couldn't travel, capacity building wasn't carried out in a conventional way. We were forced to go fully digital. Since COVID-19, the use of and the need for ITU Academy has doubled. One of our channels for capacity building is the Center of Excellence, where we began to train the trainers on how to use the platform and pass the knowledge on. Even though we needed to deal with a certain mind shift, we managed to migrate almost all regions online, as virtual learning became the new norm. Referring to all of this innovative response from my professional experience, international cooperation is a key, as Fabrizio also mentioned. We need to admit that this new online norm will remain. The role of ICTs has taken a center stage, and cooperation across sectors are essential to link development to education, health, child protection, humanitarian, and even peace-building sphere. We're all in this together, not only during, but also post-COVID-19 era. Thank you. I think you're muted, Alan.
You see how old world I am, old school. Good, very good. Thank you, Ursula, for getting us started on the panel. And we'll come back to some of those very important points you made about virtual learning and the expansion that can happen in healthcare using these new platforms and technology. I think that's really very exciting and potentially hugely beneficial for those who don't have access to modern health services. Right, now I'll come on to Hisham Al-Omisi. Again, apologies if I haven't pronounced your name correctly. Hisham has over 18 years of experience working with governmental and non-governmental organizations in the area of peace building and development, which from the perspective of his own country, I'm sure that's immensely important and immensely difficult at the same time. He's a political activist and a proponent of human rights and active citizenship. He provides commentary and analysis on the conflict in Yemen while raising publicly awareness and attempting to build a consensus around the action that needs to be taken. So Hisham will speak to us about improving access to justice through remote hearings. And again, I think it's a fascinating idea, having been involved myself in truth and reconciliation efforts in various countries around the world. This presents, again, a platform and a possibility of bringing in a far greater number of people into the process. So let's hear from you, Hisham. And again, if you could stick within the 5-minute limit, I'd be grateful. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Alan. I think you confused me with Ali Shihabi. He works on the hearings for justice and reconciliation. I do more work on peace building and capacity building in Yemen. You're muted.
My apologies, but although, again, on a practical level, there's a lot of overlap between the two.
Yes, there definitely is. Well, I basically work on peace building in Yemen, where a nationwide war has been raging for the past almost 5 years, since 2015. Faced with mounting structural, economic, and social and security challenges, even before the COVID outbreak, the pandemic has only aggravated the country's many woes, where now the UN is calling it the worst humanitarian catastrophe in the world. The conflict, characterized by many as being increasingly intractable, delineated and pitted distinctive factions against each other, all the while heightening group identity and perceptions of irreconcilability. This ultimately led to a polarization of narratives, contributed to the conflict's resistance to resolution, but also, and this is the important point, to the youth, who make a significant portion of the population, being drawn into the conflict and recruited by the fighting factions. While it is true that some joined out of convictions, others manipulated into the fighting by the various competing propaganda machines, what we found out was that many did so for the lack of skill sets, but also guidance and an increasingly shrinking pool of economic opportunities. Where in the past, we used to work with the State Department, with the European Institute of Peace and other organizations like USAID, for instance, and provided educational training opportunities at institutes, those venues were for the better part destroyed or programming curtailed. And the pandemic has further limited the mobility of people and access to those programs. So we basically had to think outside the box, and we started moving our capacity building programs and seminars online on topics that range from local governance, active citizenship, political participation, to proposal writing and project management, and where we connected youth from various parts of the country in Yemen with trainers and teachers from across the world through platforms such as Zoom, Duo, and Google Meet. And many instances, for instance, we had language barriers. And because we were bringing speakers and teachers from places like the US and elsewhere, we arranged for simultaneous translations. And one of the outcomes of that was that realizing that there was a growing demand also to learn English, we arranged for virtual English courses through institutes such as Amethyst, and we provided grants. We basically saw grants from USAID, the US State Department, and elsewhere for those courses. The feedback so far has been great, and the upside of that work was the work being more efficient, streamlined through online communications, cutting down on costs of travel, and with lower health and security risks. However, what we need to do on the next step is secure more resources for capacity building, but also provide sustainable development projects or seed money through grants, where the youth that we trained, that we taught, could apply what they learned, and the youth basically could use that and build sustainable development projects where they are at. The youth are the future, and we need to draw them out of the cycle of violence and fighting that is in Yemen and offer them an alternative path where they would help build their own communities and towards a better future. And I'll leave it at that, Alan.
Very good, thank you. I neglected to say that you yourself have been caught up in the crisis in a very direct way, that you were a victim of forced disappearance. Yes. And that you have, however, moved forward, and by working with other youth leaders within the project, Make a Place for Yemeni Youth. I can't think of anything better to do, because as Fabrizio mentioned,
there was two options. I either joined the fighting and used what happened to me and seek revenge, or I basically tried to help others not to fall into that bottomless pit of despair. So I joined with the other youth and trying to make a better place for the youth for the future.
Very good. Well, look, we'll come back to this perhaps when we have the questioning, when we've all heard from all of the panelists, because that's a really interesting issue. And I think many of your colleagues are faced with similar problems. How do we bring youth in? And despite all the pressures on them to join gangs or various forms of extremism. Right, we're going to move now to, I hope I'm not muted. No, I'm not. To Colombia, and to Cristina and Eddie Rios, who are the heads of Cooperación Genesis, an NGO dedicated to peace building in Colombia. They are two sisters, and they founded Cooperación Genesis in 2017 to work with at-risk children and again youth in rural areas. They received support from UNITAR and well as from Don Bosco, the Don Bosco Project, Youth-Led Peace and Reconciliation in Colombia, a transformational approach. They are both, by the way, this project works in Colombian villages, in rural areas, which I think is extremely important, although extremely difficult. They're both social workers, teachers, peace builders, and feminists. So they're going to speak in Spanish, but there will be simultaneous interpretation, I understand. So feel free to please carry on and speak in Spanish, and we'll try to follow. I'm sure we shall. And then again, afterwards, we'll come back and perhaps some questions later on. So over to you. Thank you, Cristina and Liz.
Buenos días a todas y a todos. Efectivamente vamos a necesitar desde aquí de Colombia el curso que mencionó Hisham, el curso de inglés, aquí también lo vamos a necesitar. Nosotros como organización pues somos relativamente jóvenes, iniciamos en el 2017 y en el 2019 la alianza con UNITAR para implementar las herramientas que construyeron.
Could I interrupt you just for 1 minute to be sure that I'm not hearing any interpretation? I don't know if anybody else is hearing any interpretation of our friend's remarks.
I can hear them clearly, their interpretation. I just have to toggle between the bottom of the link at the bottom of the page that says languages and click on English.
Ah, very good. Very good. You see, that's the way it should be. Very good. My apologies, ladies, for interrupting you. Please carry on. Excuse my ignorance of all things technological.
Bueno, entonces somos relativamente jóvenes, pues como organización, y nos hemos dedicado al trabajo con los niños y jóvenes del área rural. Siempre nos ha interesado llegar a sitios donde a veces el Estado no llega, que son poblaciones vulnerables en ese sentido. O sea, en educación, en tecnología, pues también como en procesos sociales, no llega hasta esos territorios, pues también por la lejanía, por las condiciones de acceso. Entonces, desde que nosotros nos creamos como organización, siempre hemos tenido pues como la preocupación por esas comunidades. Cuando iniciamos con UNITAR, la propuesta fue implementar los componentes perspectivas de paz para adultos y familias y viajes de héroes y heroínas con los jóvenes. Entonces, a eso se debió pues como a su trabajo en el 2019 y 2020. Y luego pues cuando llegó la cuarentena, el COVID, sí tuvimos pues varios desafíos que me imagino que más adelante les vamos a poder contarles a ustedes qué hicimos para no parar, sino innovar y poder continuar con estas comunidades. Quisiera contar un poco acerca de dónde estamos ubicados. Es en el departamento de Antioquia, en un municipio que se llama La Ceja, en el oriente antioqueño, ¿cierto? Allí, pues como decía Lady, estamos trabajando con las comunidades rurales, todo lo que tiene que ver con la construcción de la memoria histórica para la no repetición y la construcción de la paz. Estamos en medio de unos acuerdos que se firmaron entre el Estado y uno de los grupos armados, que es las FARC, aquí en Colombia. Sin embargo, digamos que los territorios rurales, o algunos de los territorios rurales, no se está trabajando o están por fuera, digamos, de este proceso de paz. Entonces, ahora que hablaban ustedes de las polarizaciones, pues aquí en Colombia también se da, y digamos que hay una necesidad sentida de la reconstrucción, digamos, del tejido social y precisamente de poder hablar de lo que pasó. Con una particularidad, y creo que es como que se comparte a nivel mundial también, y es que el conflicto armado interno todavía continúa, ¿cierto? Y que cerramos un año aislados, pero con 300 líderes y lideresas sociales asesinadas aquí en Colombia, ¿cierto? Y esto nos lleva a pensar en que estamos construyendo, digamos, propuestas alternativas de resistencia y de paz en medio todavía del conflicto. Entonces, Esto nos lleva pues como a construir una alianza fuerte con UNITAR para poder llegar a estos territorios y poder, digamos, ser aliadas y aliados en esos territorios para esas construcciones y para dar voz a las personas que allí se encuentran.
Thank you very much indeed. You stayed within the time limit. Well, the two of you and the interpretation. Thank you. It came across very well indeed. I'm sure we'll come back to this because you raised again a number of really critical issues here. Access to youth, particularly in rural areas. The fact that peace agreements don't always make peace. It's a theme I often come to because peace, durable peace, needs more than a peace agreement. It needs to rebuild the social cohesion, trust, and resilience of communities. So we'll come back to that, I'm sure, when we begin the discussion after all of the presentation. So thank you again very much for that excellent intervention. I'll now move on, if I may, to Ali Shaheen, who's a peacebuilding consultant and facilitator in the Middle East and North Africa region, working from UNITAR's mediation, and he's a UNITAR mediation and conflict analysis trainer. Ali has over 20 years of experience working on projects related to peace building, capacity building, and project cycle management in many countries in that region: Libya, Lebanon, Syria, Tunisia, and the Balkans, including 5 years with the ICRC. He's also participated in several reconciliation and mediation interventions in those countries that I've just mentioned, plus Iraq. Well, these are all countries that are still going through very, very difficult times, huge levels of violence and continuing conflict. So all the more important, the subject of his story, which is facilitating dialogue in the divided communities of Libya. So over to you, Ali. Look forward to hearing from you now.
Thank you, Alan. I'm very happy to be with you. I will cover two main parts in my intervention. First, what are the negative impacts on peace building? And second, some of the methods or innovations we try to overcome some of these negative impacts. The first negative impact is that my wife is complaining too much. I'm spending too much time at home. And this is very important. Second is that there's a shift of funding from peace and governance into more now fighting Corona. Knowing that the expenses of Corona are mainly consumable expenses on EPPs instead of investment expenses. Second, Corona itself is becoming, and treating Corona itself has becoming a cause of conflict in some societies. It has been polarized, it has been politicized, and there's a lot of misleading information that's being used, especially over social media. Third is discrimination, especially during the beginning of the outbreak, against refugees, against some minorities, against opposing communities, accusing them bringing Corona to the country. This stopped later when the virus was spread over, but it was a start. Another challenge is the online teaching, because schools and universities is a positive place for groups and communities to interact from different affiliations. Now with online, in addition to the impact on the quality of education itself, we are missing this peace space. Another impact is the in communities and countries like Idlib, for example, where they are almost post-conflict, and the communities and the NGOs are trying to move from relief into reconstruction and recovery. Now they are back into relief, fighting Corona. There's the issue of gender violence, especially a lot of domestic violence being recorded. And last challenge is the in our peace initiatives, whether in negotiations or in trainings, we're losing the direct human factor. This factor of interaction is very important, especially when we're working on peace, because this can create this space where people know each other. They forgot about who they represent, and they start to see each other as individuals, either during coffee breaks or during lunches, especially if they are in different city, they start to discover the city together. This is what we are missing. So this is some of the challenges actually which Corona has brought on peace. Now, I will discuss some of the things we tried with the UNITAR to do to overcome, especially the last challenge, which is the human interaction factor. First, we start to do pre-consultations before any event to first orient about the use of the tool. Second, to get their preferences, how to give the online courses, see the best timing for them, especially in communities where they have problem accessing internet, like in Libya. We also tried as much as possible to adopt the icebreaker exercises to way that they have more kind of mingling and interaction. We gave them homework to do jointly. We recorded recorded the sessions and gave them and put them on links. They can look back at it. And we used a lot this breakout rooms in small groups. Also, in case we were able, in a few cases, we were able to do face-to-face training, we adopted certain protocols. It's become like a protocol, which included several points to consider. First, the selection of the venue to ensure there's a proper ventilation, the issue of sanitation, this distancing between the participants, also to have a list of contacts in case any of the participants later found they were positive. We established a focal point for these protocols to be implemented. Even the coffee breaks, the foods, we were already packed foods. We have shorter sessions, more coffee breaks, so participants can go outside. Some of these practices will continue. But in general, receiving feedback on the many participants, they are looking forward back to face-to-face training. The good thing is that we have more number of participants can share. We could overcome the difficulties of visa, travel, budget. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much again, especially that latter part about how you've been trying to manage to get more value out of remote or virtual courses and training. I think there's a lot of very useful tips there that I'm sure others will profit from, and we can perhaps talk a little bit more about that, your experience and lessons learned when we come back to you a little later. Thank you very much, Ali. I'll now go to Rala Azizi, who is a curriculum advisor at the Afghanistan Legal Education Project, ALEP, and Peel's representative. He's also a Fulbright scholar, among his other accomplishments. He has more than 12 years experience in the areas of legal education, consultation, rule of law, policy making, and project management, including with USAID and the Supreme Court of Afghanistan on rule of law related projects. And he's worked on policy making, regulatory reform, remote learning, legal research, drafting, etc., for government agencies and international NGOs. He's also assisted UNITAR and UN Department of Political Operations, if I've got the right, it's changed quite a lot there in recent times, in the development of a toolkit on remote hearings to facilitate access to justice during the COVID-19 pandemic and beyond. That is where I got mixed up, as Hisham mentioned to me. So my apologies to both of you for that, but I hope it's now clear. Anyway, his story concerns building capacities and coalitions for peace in Yemen. So please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Alan. It's a pleasure to be here, and I hope everyone who can see us and listen to us are doing well during this difficult time. I would like to talk briefly about my experience working in Afghanistan and elsewhere, and the challenges I have seen with regards to access to justice. In Afghanistan, unfortunately, due to decades of war, insecurity, many other problems, lack of infrastructures, access to justice is difficult. So many people do not have access to justice. And on top of all those challenges, unfortunately, the current crisis, COVID-19, has caused more problems. And I would like to talk about some of the solutions we thought about. I have had the pleasure of working in different parts of Afghanistan. And also I'm pleased to have the experience of working here in the United States. And I've always thought about building a connection between these two experiences and think of ways that I could use from my experience working in Afghanistan here and vice versa. That's how I became interested in an initiative that started at the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, UNITAR, and also United States Office of Rule of Law, or OLC. We worked as part of a great team on a toolkit, which is specifically addressing remote hearing. So for those who don't know, remote hearing is basically using like phone or video conferences or other means of technologies to have all these court hearings remotely during this time and other similar crises. This toolkit is available on the UNITAR's website, and it's, in my opinion, a great resource for those jurisdictions and countries who do not have the experience of implementing remote hearing. We tried to look at examples of so many other countries and suggest how other countries could use this concept and this idea. They could work together, think of questions and answering them and preparing their system to implement remote hearing. It seems a very simple idea, but when it comes to implementing it, of course, it's challenging. And we tried to make this toolkit very brief, practical. It's hopefully interesting with diagrams and interactivities and visual help. So it's a reader friendly, a user friendly. And again, I suggest anyone who might be interested in this idea to visit the UNITAR's website and look at that. I believe it's a great idea. The concept of remote hearing could help overcome some of the challenges many countries are facing, including the challenges I mentioned: war, insecurity, lack of infrastructures, lack of reliable transportation, roads, things like that. So it could be used during this difficult time because of safety reasons, social distance requirement, but it could be also used in other instances as well. As much as we would like for this crisis to be ended and never happen again, unfortunately, there is no guarantee that we do not face similar crises. Climate change was mentioned earlier. Problems of such nature sometimes causes disruption in the process of having access to justice. And this process should not be stopped. People should be able to have access to justice because of its significance. There are so many studies with regards to how having access to justice contributes to the promotion of rule of law, human rights, legitimacy of the government, the state building, and overall having a peaceful and just society. And we all know that in a very peaceful and just society, all other possibilities of having economic development and prosperity comes a reality. So to conclude, I understand it's a difficult time, it's a challenging time, and it has disrupted our normal way of living and working. But it's also good to look at the positive side and look at this challenge as an opportunity of thinking outside the box, as someone mentioned, and thinking creatively on overcoming some of these challenges that many countries have been facing for years. And hopefully this idea becomes more accessible and available to many other jurisdictions to implement remote hearings and help overcoming those traditional challenges of having access to justice. Thank you so much, Mr. Atas.
Good. Thank you very much indeed. You've concluded this first round of interventions on a positive note, actually, recognizing that, as you said, crises do produce opportunities. It's a question of how we make use of those opportunities. So thank you very much indeed, Wala, for that presentation. Well, we've done our first round, and I think we're doing pretty good according to our planning. Yep, we're spot on time, just a little bit behind time, but I'm sure we'll catch up, but we're doing good. What I'd like to do now is perhaps revert to our keynote speaker, Fabrizio Hochschild, if he's still around. I hope he is, because he made a lot of very interesting comments and points during his presentation. And I'm come back to the other panelists, like to perhaps ask Fabrizio to perhaps elaborate on one or two points that he made, which I think they were all very important, very clear. And as I say, I certainly learned a lot from his intervention. But perhaps one or two points. Fabrizio, you made the point that, which was really important, that the survey revealed at once a sort of a divided humanity, as you called it. You know, on the one hand, there's a great deal of concern about growing polarization, particularly at the political level, as shown in the Security Council, and as you said, also to some extent in the General Assembly. But on the other hand, people want to move beyond do feel the need for solidarity. And if COVID has done one thing, sadly, it has made us recognize how interconnected is our world, that within less than a year, 12 months barely, there are millions of cases have spread around the world, with hundreds of thousands, millions of deaths actually. So how do we overcome that? You posited these two different elements, but the one point that you emphasize, and perhaps you could speak a little bit more on that, is that the UN's role has to change, has to evolve. It has to engage much more directly with communities and nations, move beyond to make we the peoples, if I understand correctly, a real reality, rather than we the governments, which has been the reality pretty much up to now. Any further thoughts on that, and how going forward the UN could do that? Because it's great to have these ideas out there. How do we move them forward into the realm of practicality?
Thank you, and it was fascinating listening to the other speakers. As you indicated yourself, Alan, in your response to one of the interventions, you know, the UN was born of crisis. And its predecessor, the League of Nations, was born of a war. And COVID, in that sense, for all the pain and tragedy it's inflicted, for all the tremendous damage it has done to economies, to the social fabric, is an opportunity, is a sort of wake-up call, and is an opportunity to pause and to think how we can do better. And there's been a lot of following since COVID, asking people if they want to go back to the status quo ante. And I think the vast majority of people do feel that COVID has, that forced moment of reflection has given indicators of things that need to be changed in their personal lives, their family lives, the lives of their community, of their countries, but also on the international scene. And I think in that sense, there really is an opportunity as policies are being rethought in ways that we didn't think were possible, as public budget and public investment patterns are changing in ways that were unthinkable before COVID. There really is an opportunity for a reset. And I think in the UN, there's a lot of thinking going on along those lines. The member states, there's a universal recognition that the model we were using for international cooperation was no longer adequate to address new and emerging challenges. And the member states tasked the Secretary General to come up with a series of proposals about how the work of the United Nations, how the United Nations and its mechanisms, including its intergovernmental bodies, should be reimagined and upgraded to deal with 21st century challenges. And building on our findings, that exercise has now begun, and the Secretary General will present a report by summer to heads of state for consideration. I think one of the main demands is to make the United Nations more inclusive and closer to we the peoples. It has to be said that among our findings was the observation that much as people recognize the importance of the UN, they also perceive it as rather remote and not sufficiently connected with we the peoples. And part of making it more connected is doing the sort of listening work we did, but also making the UN more inclusive and more reflective, not so much of the power holders of 50, 60, 70 years ago, but more of the multiplicity of stakeholders of today. And as you know, there's been important work on that, but there's still a long way to go. But I think one of the big challenges will be making the UN much more inclusive of many voices, of civil society, of cities, of the business. But I would say if there's one group one should highlight, it's probably of youth.
Good. Perhaps I will move on. Just a quick follow on a particular point. It is so crucial about making UN more connected, more listening, more inclusive. How do you then see technology helping the UN and broadly the international community do that? Because we begin to see opportunities there. How do you think the UN can grasp those opportunities to move beyond the rather structured, formal arrangements that we have now?
Well, I think that's happening. I mean, you know, as you can imagine, it's a difficult transition, and the UN procedures, UN meeting processes don't lend themselves to easy digitalization. But I think like our diplomatic colleagues have gone through a massive learning curve, like all of us. And I'm not sure we ever will go back to the status quo ante, even long after the vaccine has been broadly applied. I think we're going to find that our existence are much more hybrid in terms of there is a nostalgia, as I think Ali said, for in-person events, and especially in diplomacy. Diplomacy is a three-dimensional business. It's very difficult to have difficult conversations through Zoom. So returning to an analog world is essential to the functioning of the UN. But having said that, I'm sure there'll be always, post-COVID, there will always be a much greater digital component. It does allow to reach out to many more voices. But as one of the commentaries highlighted, we have to make sure that we don't exclude those who are not connected and don't have the benefits of being connected. So we have to find ways of mixing it. And I think that will be a learning experience, but many organizations, not just the UN, will be going through that.
Yes, indeed. And finding ways because not in every country will there be a willingness and openness to this. And that, I think, will be the big challenge, connecting individuals as opposed to states to the UN network. And I think that's a highly political issue, which I'm sure you and others will be wrestling with in the months and years to come. But thank you again, Fabrizio, for those very important and valuable comments. I'll perhaps now pose a couple of questions to one question to each of our panelists, and perhaps starting in reverse order this time round. And I'll start with Ruala Azizi and ask him about one thing I wanted to pick up on, and this was this issue ideas about remote learning in support of justice. It's something others alluded to as well. My concern is, and I wonder what your thoughts on that, those in most need of this connection and connectivity are those least able to get it. How do we this is great to have the learning, the platforms, the internet connections, but but the people who are most in need of it, those who are most excluded, are those who have least access. How do we get over that problem? Some of it's technology, but I think there are other issues. How do we pay for it? How do we make it a more inclusive system rather than seeing this only particularly for rural areas where most people are poorer, have least access, whether it's health, education, or even knowledge about their rights. So do you have any thoughts on that, Ruala, based on your own experience in countries like Afghanistan, which is in great need of that kind of connectivity, I imagine?
Thank you, Alan. So let me give an example of one time I visited this very rural area of Afghanistan. As part of my work, I had to visit some parts of the country, and to my surprise, there was no road to get to there. I had to walk to a village, but still, I found people or at least some people had access to phone in some parts of that area. So sometimes it's as easy as that, having whatever resources that exist in that community to utilize it. Some other times it's not that easy. We understand that not everyone has access to that luxury, having access to technology equally. So there are serious challenges. And in this toolkit, we try to look at examples of other countries when it comes to access to justice and using the technology or other means to be able to access to justice. And we try to not necessarily ask different readers or policymakers, decision makers how to do it, but try to lead them to reach and think creatively how they can do it. Some people earlier mentioned about telecommunication company. There are many other ways to utilize like public-private agreements, using other government agencies, sometimes using whatever that exists in a society to make sure that it is used to overcome this challenge and not let the process of accessing to justice being stopped due to this pandemic. It is difficult, and we can, because Afghanistan in particular is very diverse, you cannot have the solution everywhere implemented. So I wouldn't precisely say how to do it, but the questions that we were asking, we're trying to brainstorm what process they can follow to make sure identify the resources, work collaboratively and together as a team, and make use of any resources that exist to overcome these challenges.
Good, thank you, Raul. I'm sure this issue, some of the other panelists will maybe want to comment because they must be facing the same constraints in their area of work as they push forward. The next person going, let's say, in reverse order was, let me just check my notes here, was Ali. Ali, I wanted to, the point I wanted to raise with you is it's very, well, it's disturbing point that how COVID has become a polarizing factor, that there's a risk that one community already perhaps will use suspicion about COVID to exacerbate tensions, and it becomes a divisive factor in terms of discrimination, exclusion, and there's a real danger that it will, it's a bad enough problem in itself, but if this makes these other, brings these other issues to the fore and creates tensions within societies that are already suffering a lot of problems are already weak. I was wondering, would like to speak a little bit more about how you've worked to try to overcome these stigmas and divisions that COVID risks creating within societies that are already suffering considerable dislocation and sometimes violence?
Yeah, I was worried you wanted to raise the issue of my wife. That will be more difficult. The issue about discrimination, actually, this is how we see that any development that happens that goes into the conflict dynamics that are existing. The issue was only at the beginning of the outspread, okay, when we have the first cases reported. Eventually, this turned out in many communities into the outspread of COVID-19 into a positive factor, where, for example, in certain cities which were divided, health facilities which were blocked for certain groups was allowed to be reached by now with the COVID when we had this really threat. Another issue we have to see also, to consider also that COVID did have some positive impact on conflicts. For example, as a mediator or a facilitator in a process, now you have more control in the discussions, especially when you have this kind of attacks, discrimination, exclusion, like verbal insults, you can still manage it within. Another thing is that we've noticed that people come together when they face challenge or threat, they come together and also they start to cope quickly. There was a huge acceleration and progress in learning IT using it together. Some people from one neighborhood, they have very weak signal. They used to go to other people in another neighborhood. They have better signals to sit together and still, in spite of social distancing, still attend the meetings or the trainings together. The other thing to consider also is the e-governance and the increase the e-governance itself. Now, many of the services the government has been usually providing with discrimination or with corruption, they have to provide these public services, some of them through digital platforms. And really, this has made a big change. We have now to see more efficiency, less discrimination in giving public services, less corruption. And I hope this trend will continue. Nevertheless, the main challenge which will continue, which started with the outbreak of the COVID-19, and there was discrimination, who brought it first, we will face it later now when we start vaccination processes within local communities and between countries. What will happen most probably, and we're really worried about, is that some countries will be much more advanced in the vaccination process and others have already started. And we might create really isolation. And this could happen within the communities as well. So this is where we need to be very careful that as COVID outbreak did cause some discrimination, exclusion, the recovery in terms of vaccination process could have the same effect. We want to be very careful in fighting COVID, including vaccination, to consider the do no harm approach and really see how really we want to, as much as possible, to bridge two gaps. In addition to the existing gaps of poverty, justice, education, now we have two gaps we need really to consider. The one is access to vaccination, which is temporary. The other is digital access. And this will make big difference because our lives are really changing. Yani when COVID started, we thought we are making temporary measures. And this started in March. In June, we'll go back to our normal life. Now we thought in 2021, we'll go, actually, we have to start accepting our lives are changing at the personal level, family level, career, and society as a whole. It's not anymore temporary measures.
Particularly the point about training for online courses, that now that we're doing more stuff online, we have to be prepared how to handle it, how to get the most value out of it. Because for a lot of people, including myself, I might add, this is a strange phenomenon where the personal interaction. And you also made a point about often, particularly when it comes to peace building, and I think several of you alluded to this, that personal connection can't be entirely displaced by Zoom conferences or other electronic means. The things that happen when people get together, the facilitation, the person-to-person contact is something we can't afford to totally lose. So finding the right blend, I think, will be one of the challenges going forward. How to ensure we retain that person-to-person contact that makes such a difference. I've seen that myself up front in difficult situations, how that people connect and things can work, but at the same time recognizing the limitations and being able to connect with a much broader group to make peace processes much more inclusive, including for those who are victims, above all, of conflict, who we so often forget. We have a conference in an international hotel somewhere, but we forget about those whose lives have been irretrievably damaged or changed through conflict. So thank you also for those comments, Ali. I think next was Christina and Lady, who, again, I guess we have to go to interpretation at this point. I think you raised an issue again, which is resonating throughout these, and understandably, given the nature of your work, about connecting with young people who are outside, if you will, the mainstream, who are living in, not just only in rural areas, but who are often living in poverty, and certainly have no connection. Their education is limited. they are often on the margins of society. And COVID-19 will affect them disproportionately, including through quarantines and so forth. And you mentioned in particular your efforts to work in areas with the FARC. I was involved a little bit with Kofi Annan a couple of years back with Fabrizio in trying to open some of those dialogues more at the formal level, and it wasn't easy. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit, how do you see us being able to get more access to the internet, the social media, in conflict zones, which by definition tend to be the zones that are most excluded, most isolated? What have you been able to do, and what advice would you give to some of the colleagues around the virtual table as to how to better connect? Because if anything, those are the people, those are the areas that most need the connection, but are least likely to have it.
Sí, quisiera pues como iniciar con uno de los desafíos que creo que todos en el mundo nos encontramos, y es precisamente frente a un mandato de aislamiento social, cómo seguir construyendo vínculos y redes y trabajo colectivo en los territorios. Ese fue uno de las preguntas que tuvimos que empezarnos a responder con mucha creatividad, con mucho deseo y necesidad de estar en estos territorios. Allí precisamente nos encontramos con que no solamente no hay conectividad, digamos, pues como de la web, ¿cierto? De internet. Digamos que en algunas de las zonas rurales llega, como decía Rojuala, pues como el teléfono, la línea telefónica solamente. Y allí hacernos la pregunta, en términos también de juventudes, no solamente porque están aislados, digamos, en un territorio rural, que aún hoy, en el 2021, hay brechas entre lo urbano y lo rural, sino también encontrarnos con que estos chicos y chicas no tienen, digamos, capacidades o no han tenido oportunidad para tener capacidades en el manejo, o sea, en el acceso, mucho menos en el manejo y el uso de estas tecnologías de la información. Y esto nos lleva pues también como a otra cuestión que tiene que ver con cómo las y los jóvenes pueden ser autores también de las reflexiones del mundo, ¿cierto? De lo que está pasando, no solamente con el COVID, sino también con la construcción de la paz y cómo también estar todavía en medio de los conflictos, no solamente políticos, sino también esos conflictos estructurales de las violencias que todavía perduran y que están pues como muy fuertes, las violencias de género y todo, digamos la violencia intrafamiliar también, ¿cierto? Entonces, allí, ¿qué hemos hecho? No hemos podido, digamos, realizar solamente un acompañamiento virtual, sino que hemos corrido pues como con el desafío de hacer cómo construir las herramientas que son para el trabajo presencial de manera física y hacer que llegue a cada casa, a cada persona, sin que se pierda. O sea, es un trabajo mucho más individual, personal, pero también el desafío es que no se pierdan también las construcciones colectivas. Y ese es un asunto muy importante precisamente porque En un mundo lleno de polarizaciones, este aislamiento, digamos, que trae la pandemia, también profundiza precisamente el asunto individual, o sea, irnos solamente por lo individual y olvidar, digamos, las construcciones colectivas. Entonces, creo que logramos, pues, como llegar a cada persona, seguir tejiendo esos vínculos, acompañamiento, digamos, también a los jóvenes rurales y también urbanos, no solamente en los temas, digamos, de reflexión y de construcción de la paz, sino también en sus proyectos de vida, que se vieron muy trastocados también en medio de esta coyuntura, pues, como global. Y allí, pues, nosotros no somos, como corporación, no somos las voces de ellos, sino que ellos son sus propias voces. Y lo que hacemos nosotros es traer esas voces para que puedan aportar, porque hay una tendencia, pues yo lo llamo adultocéntrica, digamos, en temas sociales, políticos, y es que se piensa que las y los jóvenes no pueden aportar a esas construcciones. Y creo que UNITAR trae, digamos, un enfoque muy importante, y es precisamente que son las juventudes, las nuevas generaciones, quienes tienen que construir ese pensamiento crítico para poder transformar.
Good, thank you very much indeed. Your point is well taken, that while we focus on digital communication and the group engagement, we shouldn't forget the personal, and we have to find ways to connect at a personal level as well, and particularly when it comes to issues which you underlined, and as did, by the way, Ali, about domestic violence, which has been, there's evidence, I think, from around the world that with lockdown, with quarantines, with isolation, domestic violence has grown quite significantly in many countries around the world. And this is something it's hard to deal with in a collective fashion, because every household, every family, every social grouping is different. But it is one of the consequences of the COVID pandemic that is now increasingly understood, and we need to talk about it. But then doing something about it has to be probably more at the individual personal level that you have emphasized. So thank you very much for those remarks as well. I'll then come on to, let me see, Hisham, yes. I think if you're there, you made a number of, the points about how COVID is, complex challenges, or it's complicating already complex challenges, if I can put it that way. I think we would all agree with that, and your fellow panelists have made the same point. And you've given us some good examples of how you've tried to make use of turn a crisis into an opportunity, including virtual English lessons, which I think it's always a very, very interesting approach. But you stress the point that youth and the fighting faction, lack of guidance, but lack of opportunity. And you yourself being an example of somebody who broke away from that by dint of surely personal commitment. But does that, how can we broaden that? How can we say that during this time of COVID, which is adding complications, as you said, to complexity, how do we engage with young people? We've had some examples today, but on a wider scale, to provide alternatives, because that's, again, from my own experience, I know, if you're a young adolescent, usually male, I have to say, growing up in a society which doesn't really care very much for you, you don't have the opportunities, no skills, very little education. What do? How do you break out? Do you join a gang for your protection? Do you join a militia? Do you join a radical group? How do you deal with that? And is COVID making that worse? And if so, how are we going to push back to basically ensure that young people are not cut off with no opportunity, no alternatives. Your thoughts, please, Isham.
Sure, thank you for that. You're absolutely right. This is one of the things that I actually wanted to follow up with what Christina and Lady said, is that you need to reach out to the youth and not just represent them, but become a vehicle to amplify their own voices. This is what we're trying to do. And a lot of instances, and this is what will happen over the past few years since the Arab Spring here in the Middle East, is that you had people who are basically up the top, hijacking movements, and basically becoming representatives of the majority of the population and providing their own views on things or their own agendas, if you will, with the majority of the youth and other groups as well, including the women, being marginalized. And this is basically what we found out when we came back to Yemen and we started discussing issues such as, for instance, transitional justice, when we started talking about peace building. And the world had this image that the Yemenis have a consensus on these specific issues. But when we reached out to youth, not even going through the remote areas, just in the cities, we found out that the youth had a very different perspective. So we followed, for instance, one of the projects that we did was with the European Institute of Peace. We did a small survey, and instead of just focusing on youth leaders, the traditional leaders of the society, we reached out to the youth in the city and distributed surveys. It's like, what do you think about this so-and-so issue? And they had a totally, completely different opinion on issues, which helped us revamp and totally overhaul, basically dispel myths and overhaul misconceptions. And similarly, when we wanted to, again, provide projects, provide opportunities of education and training and capacity building, we did not go to the usual models, like here's the usual suspects, what we reach out to, but instead, we basically, for instance, we'll put up an ad on social media. We know, for instance, almost 33% of Yemenis are on Facebook. So we put up an ad on Facebook, like if you want to sign up for a course, here's the way you sign up for it. And it's merit-based. We're not going to go down the path of usual suspects. And when we wanted to basically get some feedback, again, forget the usual channels, we go directly to the public and directly to the youth on the ground. One of the things that we noticed, and this touches basically on everybody's, on the panelists' issues that they had with connectivity, people living in rural areas, people that don't have strong internet, we had to downgrade the platforms. Where initially Duo, Zoom, or video conferencing on whatever platform, we created groups on WhatsApp, for instance, or Signal that require very little bandwidth and is accessible by everywhere, everybody in Yemen and everywhere. And we created groups. And I noticed one of the questions that popped up on the screen in the chat was something about mentorship. Here is the thing that was a collateral result, but it was a nice result, is that when we started creating these groups, because people were like, after we're done with webinars, done with training, people said, okay, it was very static. You finished with the teacher, then you're off doing your own thing, and you completely forget about the webinar. So we created a follow-up. We created these small groups on WhatsApp is that to ensure continuity and to have that little interaction. We cannot interact face-to-face, but here is some form of a mini personal interaction through WhatsApp groups. And we realized more and more people were joining the WhatsApp groups and people getting in touch with us directly, asking us questions like, thank you for that webinar or that capacity building training, but how can I apply this in my real life? So we started advising people on WhatsApp groups. Okay, here's your skill set. What kind of project do you want to do? They said, like, for instance, one of the projects that was inside that, they said, we want to do solar panels in greenhouses. We're like, okay, here's where you can procure it. We don't have money, they don't have money. Like, okay, here's how you prepare a proposal. And here's how you can submit it and where to submit it to. Here are the opportunities, grant opportunities that you could apply to. And people started doing that. So we started connecting A to B points. And it was nice, but here's the thing, it's very taxing because when you have a handful of trainers and you have a handful of mentors who are willing to volunteer their time, it's not overburdened, then you have hundreds and hundreds of people connecting to just a handful of people. And that's one of the things that I mentioned in my presentation is that we need to scale up that model and we need more resources to have more mentors, more trainers, so that we could host and help more youth on the ground.
Very good. I mean, Isham, you raised a number of issues there, but I'm conscious of time, and we should be getting on to some of But all of those points are very well taken. And particularly a point about WhatsApp, because WhatsApp shows how it can be used for good, but we also know how it's been used for bad, creating extremist groups and so forth. So, but one thing I think we found, if I may mention my organization I was affiliated with, and still are, the Kofi Annan Foundation, and its Extremely Together program, bringing young people together to talk about and deal with extremism. One of the things we started, which was really important, was peer-to-peer learning. Not just having, if I may say, old white men like myself in suits giving lessons, getting young people to talk to young people who've been involved. That is really the best way in our experience of getting involvement, getting engagement, because it's them telling their stories to young people who've lived the same sorts of stories and are looking also for answers and for experiences that they can build on. So thank you very much, Isam. I've got to move on. Ursula, you're the very patient. I just had a couple of questions because we've covered a lot of the same ground, and but you rightly pointed out the inequalities between within countries, as we're seeing now with education, remote education. It's evident even in, well, especially perhaps in some of the advanced countries, economically speaking, we still have huge numbers of young people who do not have access to the kind of remote learning, and this has profound effects on social cohesion over time, which is a big worry. But also, of course, the point that 50% of people in the global south are not yet connected. I recall the digital divide, a phrase you used, was first coined in the late 90s. That was 20 years plus ago, and still we're talking about it. So how do you see us getting beyond the digital divide? And to what extent is that a divide? In what sense is that a divide? Because I'm always struck, I spent a lot of time in some pretty remote parts of Africa and Eastern Congo, and I was always astonished to see how young people had somehow got themselves connected. They could buy literally a minute of calling time on a mobile phone. Somebody set up a little booth, and they could borrow time or pay for it on an iPad. So people are very ingenious. So I would just wonder, how can we harness these sort of approaches so we can bridge the digital divide internally, but also externally? And I'm sure ITU is very much engaged in that project.
Thanks, Alan. Yes, when we're talking about when we're talking about digital divide, of course, there are different extents. Some people does not have fulfilled connectivity. Some people in some areas in the world doesn't have it all. And it's all about infrastructure that needs to be provided. And what I think it's this COVID-19 and this new norm we're living under that enormously highlighted the need for connectivity. And I think it raised countries' awareness as well, how important ICTs and the digital access to the digital world is. What we do when in terms of referring to education, what you mentioned, we started to work on the project with UNICEF. It's called GIGA. And what we're actually doing is that we're accelerating the development of financing structures in a number of priority countries. As I mentioned, as you mentioned, that I mentioned before too, I work in the Telecommunication Development Bureau. So we're only focusing on developing countries in my bureau. And we're trying to catalyze the funding required to bring connectivity to schools. And it's importantly great to see that private sectors and all our membership are very much dedicated and collided to the cause at this point to be able to bridge this digital divide. But I think it needs further international cooperation as well.
Okay, and does this cooperation come through intergovernmental bodies, or will it be more through the private sector, for example?
It actually Our cooperation comes through private sector, intergovernmental bodies, academia, but I believe that even every other organization we all should work together on this, because this is very much a key now, even for peace building and any other sector in the world.
Yeah, I think certainly we need a coherent response. It can't just be governments. And I know, for example, in the region, the Africa region, it's really been the private sector that has broken away from public state utilities, state corporations that ran the telecoms, ran them into the ground, I have to say. And it's been the private sector, people like Mo Ibrahim of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, who made tremendous breakthroughs. And people now have access to modern telecommunications, which was inconceivable even 10, 15 years ago. So there is progress, but it's still a major issue. As one of our questioners, and I'm just trying to find that question. There's so many, and we're on to that segment now, the last half hour. So I'm going to try to squeeze out a few questions, and I think whoever wants to respond, I will not. I'll let you put up your hand of some kind, in some way, electronically or physically. And there was one question here that it was just trying to find it now. There's been quite a few questions have come in, so it's a tribute to your presentations. But basically the question said, well, how can we do all of this while we're sort of trying to just survive, make ends meet in this time of COVID? What do we do? I mean, these ideas are all very good, but we're out there and we just are struggling with day-to-day survival. Does anybody want to perhaps respond on that? As I say, feel free to just put up your hand and speak. Unmute yourself and just speak. Don't be shy. Yeah, please go ahead, Roland.
That's very true. I think it's unfortunately this crisis are causing serious safety concerns, taking lives, and so many other issues to many. And it will be very ideal to say that everything could be solved in a day, or so many problems could be solved quickly. But in particular, in the area that I talked and I'm interested to do more research about is about access to justice. There are still ways to think, just I use the phrase outside the box, but thinking creatively or thinking differently to utilize whatever that exists. Like my experience, I mentioned that I work in Afghanistan and then I work in the United States. When I moved here, it was surprising to me when I went to a library and you could do almost everything there, not only taking a book, but when reading a book, but also doing like immigration services, applying for anything, government services, to receiving trainings, leaving kids there for other learning programs. So it's a way to think what resources exist in the community without like changing everything from scratch, and identifying those resources and potentials and kind of utilizing that. When I take it back to Afghanistan, again, I do acknowledge that it's difficult, for example, to have these facilities, rooms, internet connection, technology, but it doesn't also mean that it's lacking. There's nothing at all. So it's just thinking a little differently and doing our best to overcome some of these challenges and to think of more sustainable solutions and preventing similar challenges that crisis of this nature is causing. That's the only point I was making. So while it's very true that so many things cannot be happening very quickly everywhere, but still just thinking a little differently and working together and being optimistic. That's the experience that Afghanistan has given me. Afghans are very resilient people, and it's always nice to be hopeful and resilient at these difficult times. So I do also want to mention that still there are ways to at least do our best to overcome some of these challenges.
Good, thank you. Hisham, you wanted to respond as well.
Yes, I wanted to mention that one of the things is that we need to stop thinking of top bottom and start thinking about bottom up. For instance, in Yemen, the case was where it's a closely knit society where the social fabric is pretty strong. So we directed people who thought like, okay, you can custom tailor programs. One of the programs that we offered, for instance, the trainings, we offered them in the evenings where people had to go about doing their own things, earning a livelihood in the day. So we offered the programs at night. And where communities, for instance, people said like, okay, this is going to be a virtual webinar. I don't have the internet or I don't have the PC, for instance. And I think Ali or someone else who mentioned this is that we advise people to basically, if you're in Sana'a, you can move to a neighborhood where there's internet, where there's a friend of ours to our community, to our network, could provide a room where you could all get together. And of course, you have to mitigate the factor of the COVID and the conflict, of course, there's a war raging there. But these are some of the solutions that it was community provided solutions, and you have to look into those, and you have to start thinking outside the box. Is that people think there's a one solution that fits all? No, actually there are multiple solutions on the local level. And even through our peer networks, we started providing jobs that could provide at least some minimum pay. For instance, delivering food or delivering services. And we managed to get people jobs even for people who are like completely poor or they don't have any source of income.
So community-based solutions, I mean, I think that's a really good idea, even though, you know, community is being not pulled apart, but the strains are greater now with COVID, but community-based solutions like finding space for people to meet and join a joint webinar or whatever it is, I think that's definitely something can be done locally where there's that kind of interest in innovation. So it's an interesting response. I'm going to move on to another question here. Let me read out it from Mr. Nasir Hassan. It says, my question is, during this pandemic, the online kind of holding meetings, educating and learning conferences, etc., I felt totally omitted or highly decreased. Sure I'm reading this right. The element of, I missed, that probably means I highly missed, the element of interactivity that create the element of collaboration through discussions, particularly in areas where people are having limited technology access. In effect, we've touched on this. So does these two, which virtual online challenges, so which of these two virtual online challenges affect the desired productivity and performance levels, particularly peace building and education? In other words, how do we compensate for the decreased interaction which has been caused by the COVID pandemic and its impact on bringing people together, which you need to do to advance peace building and reconciliation? How do we sort of find a way through on those to bridge that challenge which has emerged with COVID? Did I see Christina and Lady wanted to respond on that initially? I'm sure some of the others might want to also. Yes, please, Christina and Lady.
Sí, sobre este tema. Creo que, claro, nos encontramos con un modelo o con un mandato de aislamiento social que nos implicó recurrir, digamos, a las tecnologías de la comunicación y hacerlo de manera virtual. Sin embargo, siento, o pues también nos dimos cuenta, que no puede ser lo uno o lo otro. Estamos nuevamente aparece la polarización, o es blanco o es negro. Y creo que es muy importante reconocer que hay muchas estrategias que tienen que, digamos, desarrollarse a la par. Entonces, a la par de, digamos, de una oportunidad de una reunión virtual, es fundamental también pensar en otras estrategias pedagógicas, metodológicas, que nos ayuden, digamos, a seguir, digamos, tejiendo individual, pero también colectivamente. Entonces, nosotras como corporación desarrollamos unas cajas de herramientas, pues como unos kits, ¿cierto? Que eran, digamos, la posibilidad para que estas personas pudieran seguir trabajando desde sus casas de manera personal, pero también tratamos de que unas herramientas que habían sido pensadas para el trabajo presencial, las reconfiguramos para que fueran, digamos, trabajadas a nivel individual. sin que se perdiera, digamos, el elemento vivencial, reflexivo. Y allí invitábamos mucho también como al trabajo con las familias. O sea, no era, digamos, un asunto de me pienso yo y solamente yo, sino también, digamos, fortalecer también como unas dinámicas familiares ahí. Y llegamos, con esas cajas, llegamos a cada casa. Entonces, es la posibilidad también de saber. Por ejemplo, había un elemento simbólico que es el tapabocas, el tapabocas, no sé cómo se llamará. Y nosotras reconfiguramos, digamos, simbólicamente este elemento que puede parecer, digamos, que se va a perder la palabra, la posibilidad de la conversación, del diálogo, y este elemento lo reconfiguramos para decir que es un abrebocas. O sea, es la posibilidad de seguir protegiéndonos, pero seguir conectados y conectadas para seguir conversando sobre los temas que nos convocan. Entonces, estrategias así, que creo que tienen que ser complementarias, que no se puede hacer una o la otra, sino al mismo tiempo varias.
Very good. Well, I hope you'll share your toolbox with the other panelists, but also send me a copy. I'd be very interested to see what's in. I'd like to open the box, see what's in there, because I'm sure that it'll be of wide interest. These are very practical things we all need to share and learn from, and that's part of the idea of this event, this webinar. I have now a question I've been reminded to ask, which I'm happy to do, from Alibel Mengistu Lema in Ethiopia. And I'm just going to read it. And I've heard from the panelists that so as to reach youth in remote areas on enhancing peace building, we use social medias, including Facebook, WhatsApp, or internet. If all of the above are not available, can we use conventional ways like SMS, radio, and recorded materials, as these are youth-friendly in remote areas? I added a postscript as well. I mean youth-friendly as managing the contemporary digital devices. If we can give profound attention for accessibility, managing items may be given meager attentions unless you work on capacity building on managing modern digital items technology. That is from Albella in Ethiopia. I think it's a good question, because I'm sure all of you are working on these issues in remote areas, isolated areas, and more generally areas that are not well served, may have a response on that. I'm not sure. I was told that, let's see, that Hisham wanted to say something in response. Go ahead, Hisham, and then we'll have time probably for one or two more questions, including one that's directed at Madam Beda. So go ahead, Hisham.
Okay, sure. For Alabel, I wanted to answer that question because we actually used SMS and we use Telegram. Telegram uses a much less bandwidth. And we actually, when it comes to SMS and radio, we amplified existing messages for peace building, for instance, encouraging people not to join the fighting, encouraging youth that there's alternative paths. So it was focused messaging. And when it came to the material, the training material, we created slides and PDF material, and we translated actually a lot of it into Arabic, and we sent it through Telegram to those remote areas where they could actually read it. And we provided basically a guidebook for those areas. And the feedback has been nice, but you miss the interaction. It's kind of difficult to get feedback when you broadcast or amplify messages through radio and SMS, and you don't get feedback. But we've been getting a lot of feedback through Telegram for the materials. Again, we created, just like WhatsApp, we created program groups in Telegram where if they had questions on the material, they would ask questions and we would respond to them.
That's very practical advice. I saw Christina and Lady nodding vigorously there. I assume there'd be some applications in Colombia and other, particularly the rural areas that they spoke about earlier on, but I'm sure that's of interest. I think, again, the virtue of this event is to share these experiences and show that even with existing constraints, you can still do a lot. I have a question now for, if I may, for Ursula from Tiffany Grabaski. I apologize if I've not pronounced the name well. She asked questions for Ursula Beda. What can the ITU and other international organizations do to better facilitate cooperation between the public, private, non-profit, and multilateral sector when it comes to dealing with quickly emerging dynamic challenges like COVID? Ursula, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, thank you, Alan and Tiffany. I believe that a more inclusive approach from the international organization side as well needs to be implemented, where the platform is given to all the stakeholders. And obviously, this is a new situation, for all of us, not just personally, but of course for organizations as well and the whole world. But when it comes to facilitating these and responding to these emerging and dynamic challenges, we need to learn, first of all, the lessons learned from this year, or last year, sorry. And for example, what ITU did is we created a platform which is direct for COVID, where we opened up to ICT regulators, policymakers, and every other interested stakeholders to share information and share best practices. It also has a section dedicated to emergency response, how member states or the public can deal with such challenges. And obviously it's going to take time, but it has to be a more inclusive approach, even further inclusive approach from all the sectors.
Good. Well, I think the positive points, though, is that the cost of technology has dropped dramatically and will continue to drop, which will make it much more affordable to everybody. Even if it's not the latest technology, you can buy a cheap phone now for a fraction of what the price was, just a few years ago. So I think that's the positives, and the innovation is getting us there part of the way. But you still need, the infrastructure. But I think, the way things are going, it should be within the reach of not everybody, that's for certain, but within I would think a large percentage of the global population within a matter of, certainly within the course of this decade, possibly earlier, if you look at the rate of expansion of networks and so forth. There's a last question I had, which was directed at me, but I'm going to redirect it to you who do the work on the ground, and in particular, perhaps to Ali and to Rala in this last round. It was addressed to me. It is from Ibiam Ude Ufem. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing his or her name right, but I apologize again. And it was, as a budding peace builder, is there any chance of getting mentorship with any of our speakers? I really want to grow. Well, what do you think, folks? How do we do it through UNITAR? Do it directly? I'm not proposing to give your addresses out over the air, but clearly, I'm sure that other people will say these are all very interesting ideas. How do we get some feedback from people who are there on the front lines, like all of you, doing these things every day? How do we connect with people who want to get any suggestions from your part? Let's start with Ali and Ruala, and then if the others want to chip in, we should be just about at 4 o'clock and have to wind up.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Actually, I'm very much available. I'll be happy through any means of digital communication to share any questions. I hope that UNITAR can share my email and WhatsApp number also with the participants attending. There's no problem at that. But my big advice for peace builders is it's about practicing. Start with your own community. Peacebuilding is not a profession, it's not career, it's a role you play in your community. Start with your neighborhood. This is the starting point really to build capacity in that perspective. And it's not only skills, it's more values, principles you think about. The first principle we always start with in mediation is respect. It's the first one always. It's respect, ownership. And we aim always to have sustainable peace. And sustainable peace needs sustainable peace builders who are there in the community. I'm very happy and will be very happy also to have any chat, also share experiences, because it's always keep learning. One thing I just want to mention, question was mentioned about confidentiality quickly, because it was mentioned by my friend Fadi. How we can ensure confidentiality when we're doing online mediation. Actually, the issue of leakage is already there face-to-face. We cannot ensure it once they leave the room. The different factor when we come with Zoom or online mediation is the recording. How shall we do recording, and to whom to share recording? Here we have different options. First is to ask permission of the participants if they accept recording, and encourage them to not to be shy, express concerns. Other option is to edit the recording. For example, if we're doing training, we only edit and keep those who are the trainer presenting. These are some of the options we can consider for confidentiality, because leakages can really damage these processes. We've seen this in Yemen, we've seen it many ways in Libya. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's wise. Good advice. Thank you very much for that, Ali. Rola, would you like to add a final word on this, on mentorship and how to connect?
Sure, I'm glad for that request, and I ask my colleagues at UNITAR if do you receive any requests regarding being connected with me? Definitely forward it to me. I have a website that I normally share about my work and experience, and it's publicly available. So I suggest that you can search my name, and I'd be more than happy to keep in contact and to work collaboratively and work with all the youths around the world on these topics of mutual interest. Thank you so much.
Very good. And I'm sure the same would apply for our other panelists, Hisham, Christina, and Lady, as well as Ursula. But I will leave them to let UNITAR know of their availability. But it's good that people want to talk to you and want to keep in touch, because, but as Ali just so wisely said, peace building begins at home. In the family, in the community, in the region, in the country, but you have to start somewhere. So I think today has been very, for me at least, very both enlightening but also encouraging. COVID has cast a very dark shadow over the world, and including and the interesting sad thing is it's the most advanced countries in the world that have suffered proportionally the most. Interestingly enough, and they're having to come to grips with the fact that despite all the technology, the resources, the training, education, they've not been invulnerable, which shows us that we do live in an interconnected world, which is what the UN 75th anniversary was about, showing that interconnection and finding ways to strengthen it, and not just to retreat behind our national barricades and to polarize our differences, but rather to build on them. So every crisis provides an opportunity. I just hope through the work of people like your good selves out there in communities, we will make the most of this opportunity and not be consumed by this crisis. So thank you again, and also to our audience virtually who've listened in, and of course to our friends and in UNITAR who put this all together through the Division of Peace, and particularly to Nikhil, to Evariste, and to Katerina, many thanks. And again, I wish you well. I wish you a good new year, and